All right, AP Environmental, I want to pick up where the last video left off here. So we kind of left off on this slide where it kind of cut us off a little bit, but you were talking a little bit about just some of these, chemicals that are in your house. Again, just kind of look through that list, and you'll probably see a few things that look familiar to you that you probably have out in your garage, or you might have in a closet somewhere in your house. But the one thing about these products, they are hazardous and they can cause environmental problems. But how do you get rid of them? We definitely don't want to throw these things in the trash. Throw them out so that they eventually get into landfills. So one thing about these is you would call your disposal company, and they would probably send someone out to remove these, or they would tell you where to take them. But again, what's the easiest thing to do, right? Just like throw it in the garbage. So we shouldn't be doing that. So just keep that in mind. All right. Now, today I want to talk a little bit about just some different types of legislation. These are two acts that you're going to have to know for the AP exam when it comes to dealing with hazardous waste. The first one is called the RCRA Act, the RCRA. I'll discuss what it is in a second. And the other one is called the CERCLA Act, the CERCLA Act. And again, I'll explain exactly what these two things are. So the first one, the RCRA Act, this one deals specifically with the production and eventually the disposal of hazardous waste. And what this act basically does is it allows the government to track, where hazardous chemicals are made, in our country, and where they're being sold from. For example, if a company is making, I don't know, a pesticide, which could be considered a hazardous waste, we need to know where that's being made, and we need to know where it's being sold. Is it being sold by Walmart or Target or Ace Hardware or what? It also manages any type of like industrial hazardous waste in underground tanks. So, for example, if a industry or a factory is producing, millions of gallons of hazardous waste, which needs to be stored, in tanks, the RCRA Act allows the government to not only know where that's being produced, but also to manage where it's being stored. So the federal government knows exactly where all this hazardous waste is, and they also allows the government to create laws based on the transportation of these things. So, I mean, this RCRA Act, again, it is designed to help our government track the production of hazardous waste. We call it from cradle to grave. So when it's produced to eventually where it's stored, the government knows exactly where that's happening. Now, the other act is called the Superfund Act. It's also known as the CERCLA Act. The CERCLA Act, but again, you're going to most likely hear it called the Superfund Act. The Superfund Act allows money from the government. It provides federal money to be set aside, kind of like as a rainy day fund. Like we put this money aside, we save it in order to clean up any type of hazardous waste sites if there's any type of spill or accident or release of some type of chemical into the environment. It also gives the EPA, the government, the power to seek out who's responsible for producing these hazardous chemicals and allowing them to get into the environment. Now, there's a term here, it's called a Superfund site. Well, you know what a Superfund site is. A Superfund site is any land in our country that has been contaminated by hazardous waste. And it's been identified by the Environmental Protection Agency as an area that must be cleaned up immediately or as soon as possible because it poses a risk to human health and or the environment. So once they identify a location, Then they put it on what we call the National Priorities List, which is a list of Superfund sites that the EPA is going to clean up, okay? Or we're going to find someone to clean it up. The problem with some of these Superfund sites is, for example, if you look at these green dots, I mean, they're all over the country. We've got several of them here in the Midwest. There's a ton of them out on the East Coast. New Jersey's got a whole bunch of these things. But the green ones are areas where that have been cleaned. They've been finalized. Well, I'm not going to say they've been cleaned, but they've been identified as areas that need to be cleaned. And then these darker dots, there's a few of them. Those are areas that are proposed to eventually become Superfund sites. But again, these Superfund sites, for whatever reason, there has been hazardous waste that has caused some type of environmental problem, and they need to be cleaned up because that stuff is causing health-related issues. Now, if we can't find someone that's responsible for it, then the government will handle it. But when the government handles it, guess who pays for it? I do, and you do, and your parents do. It comes out of taxpayer dollars. All right, so make sure we know what a Superfund is. I want to talk about one specific site, which is an area called Love Canal, New York. Love Canal was basically the first ever Superfund site. Um, Basically, just to kind of give you a little history lesson about it, back in the 1800s, for about 100 years, there was a company called Hooker Chemical. And Hooker Chemical, was a company that manufactured, I don't know, a whole bunch of different things, but they produced a bunch of hazardous waste. So they did what they were supposed to do. They put it all in these big steel containers, and they basically just dumped them into an old canal, which is kind of an underground river, basically. So they did that for 100 years. It's just like, tons and tons of toxic waste. Now, eventually in 1953, the canal was filled. It was filled with dirt, and they sold it to the Niagara Falls School Board. They said, here you go, here's a piece of land you can build your school on. Now, I will say this, Hooker Chemical did tell the school board that, hey, we're selling you this land, but we're just telling you that we put like hundreds of gallons, or I should say hundreds of barrels of toxic waste underneath the soil. So you may not want to disrupt that soil in any way, because if you do, then some of that toxic waste could come to the surface. So what they did was eventually they built an elementary school on top of it. They built like baseball fields, and eventually like homes were built. And all of this stuff disrupted the soil that was sitting on top of a bunch of toxic waste. Well, in the 1970s, people started complaining. People were getting sick. There was a bad odor coming up from the ground. And again, in the 1970s, President Jimmy Carter said, these people have to leave here. The government actually paid people money, gave them money to leave their homes and go somewhere else, because you could not live in that area because it was so toxic. But eventually it was cleaned up. It took 20 years and $400 million to clean up all the toxic waste out of Love Canal. All right, but it was the first Superfund site that was ever designated. And you can imagine, so I mean, this one here took 20 years, $400 million. I mean, let's go back to this picture, right? I mean, think of how long it's going to take to clean all these things up. But at least our government is trying to identify these places and doing something to try to clean them up, but it might be years before some of that stuff eventually gets cleaned. Now, we also have these areas called brownfield sites. Brownfield sites are contaminated sites, but they don't essentially, how do I put this? They don't they're not to the level of what a Superfund site is, for example. I mean, let's say that like this old abandoned building. And let's say that there's asbestos in there or something or some chemical. Here we have a whole bunch of, I don't know, abandoned rubber tires. Those things are all toxic to the environment. Um, as long as you don't like go there, you're probably fine. But a brownfield site basically is contaminated to the point where you can't build anything there until the government comes in and cleans it up. The thing about brownfield sites is they're not managed by the federal government. They're managed by state governments and local governments. So there's over 450,000 brownfield sites in the US. I'm sure there's tons of them in Chicago and Indianapolis and the suburbs of those cities and all over the country. But again, the big thing with these is they're designated by um, federal or state governments and local governments and not by the federal government. So it'll be, for example, let's say this building here, it'll be up to the state to or the local government to clean that up, not up to the feds. All right. Uh, Superfund sites are federal. All right. So when it comes to cleaning up hazardous waste, three things: we can reduce it, we can mitigate it, or we can store it. All right. Best, better, worst. Make sure we understand that. When it comes to mitigating it, that means like trying to remove it from the environment. We can do this through several processes. We can use chemicals, to actually remove some of the other chemicals that are in the environment. Um, that usually works pretty well, but eventually, some of those chemicals are bad as well. There's biological mitigation where we can use bacteria or plants or even funguses to help clean up some of that hazardous waste from the soil or possibly from the water, like we talked about bioremediation with oil before. Finally, incineration. A lot of hazardous waste, we can actually heat it to really, really hot temperatures. And that will actually break down some of those chemicals that are in some of that hazardous waste and make them less hazardous. But again, I mean, these things, you know, we can do them, but I don't know if they're not 100% effective. So just going back to this, I mean, the best thing to do is just reduce it. Just don't use it at all. But then if we have to mitigate, then we have to mitigate. And then finally, I mean, if the worst case scenario is to store it. There's different ways that we can store hazardous waste, but this doesn't really remove the problem. It just kind of puts a band-aid on it. And this is what we call deep well disposal, where they basically just dig a huge well and then just pump hazardous waste down into it. That's a big problem if there's water or aquifers near it. There's what we call surface impoundments. This is kind of like a big landfill, but they fill it with hazardous waste containers, and they just let it sit there underground, forever. And then sometimes they store it on land. This kind of similar when we talked about like nuclear fuel rods, being stored on land. But instead of fuel rods, these are actually containers of hazardous, chemical waste. But again, we just let them sit there, for hundreds of years. Remember we talked about fracking. Remember the fracking video or the gas land? They have those big like containers on the surface. Those things are just holding all that fracking fluid, all that hazardous waste, all that spent water, and it's just going to sit there, forever. Sometimes we even ship it off to other countries. If we ship it off to other countries, at least countries that'll pay for it, or I should say that will take our, because we'll end up paying other countries to do this. Just like all the other waste that we don't want in our country, we'll just put it on a boat and we'll just ship it off to Bangladesh or whatever country is kind of needing the money. Again, this brings up environmental justice issues. Is this fair that we pay these poor countries to take all of our hazardous waste? I don't know. I mean, we created it, right? We're just peddling it off on these poor countries. I don't know. It kind of makes you feel dirty a little bit, but that's what we do. So anyway, all right, guys, that is it for the notes. I will see you soon.